The worst job I ever had, without a shadow of a doubt, was working at a movie theater in New York City in the early 80s. Sometimes when the movie ended and the lights came up, me and the cleaning staff would walk into what I can only describe as a post-apocalyptic scene. Every kind of bodily fluid or secretion you can imagine, I've cleaned it up. We had people who we thought might be dead, people who were screwing around and didn't stop when the movie ended. Every deadly sin there is, we walked in on it. But by far the worst part of the job was trying to keep order in the theater itself. We're constantly calling the cops on people who were fighting, doing drugs, just about any scumbag activity you can imagine. People did it in our theater. They tended not to screw with my coworkers and me so much as they knew that they'd have red and blue flashing lights outside, but it was still one heck of a job. Only once did someone actually put me in any danger, but my God, was it enough to last a lifetime. I'd had people scream and shout at me, but at 6'3", most people knew better than to get physical. But this one guy, he didn't even have to get all that violent. He didn't have to shout or scream, and he had me just about soiling my pants. So it all started when I was working the late shift, 5:30 p.m. to midnight or close, and for some reason I could just tell it was going to be a rowdy one. It was a Friday night, it was coming up on Halloween, and people were so jacked up that I swear it was a full moon or something too. Needless to say, I braced myself for one heck of a shift, but honestly, if I'd have known how messed up that night was going to be, I think I've just locked myself in the ticket office and stayed put until closing, in which I'd probably just end up pulling the fire alarm again. Yes, I had to do that more than once, and the fire department told me I'd be fined if I did it again. Anyway, I sell out a theater, make a show of checking some stubs, and sit back in the ticket booth to avoid the crazies. Then out of nowhere, someone walked up to the register and says, "Hey, I think someone is sick in there." I asked if they puked, and they said no, that I think they're on drugs or something. I'm serious, I think you should call 911. I didn't want to call the EMTs and then find out that someone had just fallen asleep or whatever, so I decided to just go check it out first, and if it was serious, I'd call 911. I follow the girl into the dark theater, and she points out who she's talking about. At the very end of one row, there was this punk rock-looking couple, crazy hair and leather jackets. The guy had his arm around the girl, and she's leaning on his shoulder. It didn't look too rough at first glance, just an unconventional couple enjoying a show of that freaky new Tron movie, as I like to call it. People sometimes ask how I remember which exact movies was showing, and I always respond with something like, when you feel like your entire world is about to end, you pick up on all the little details for some reason. So, back when I used to work the theater, I used to carry this weak little keychain flashlight that proved its worth on more than one occasion. I shine the light on the ground near the couple, and lo and behold, there's a bunch of puke at the girl's feet. Then I quickly shine the light on her, and yep, she's in a bad way. She obviously is not fully conscious, and she seems to be trembling while leaning on her guy, and I'm pretty sure she's either ODing or she's really sick with something. Either way, I'm calling 911. I just want to know why the punk guy doesn't seem to care that she's in such a state. So putting on my most polite, yes sir, no sir service voice, I lean in and ask the guy if he or his lady friend require any medical assistance. At first the guy just gives me the finger and tells me to get lost. Normally I just back off, no crummy job was worth getting punched in the face over. But this one solitary occasion I just couldn't walk away. You see, this dude was much older than the girl, maybe in his late 30s, early 40s, and she looked like she was no older than a high school junior. It just seemed like predatory, you know? Plus, she legit looked like she was ODing. This is going to sound harsh, but I don't really care if some hardcore junkie scumbag dies, but some younger person, some girl, who could have easily gotten a second chance in life. Nah, it wasn't going to happen on my time. But as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. I ended up making the nearly deadly mistake of reaching out and tapping this dude on the shoulder. I didn't tap him hard, it wasn't aggressive, nothing like that. It was just to let him know, I'm not messing around here. The girl needs medical attention, and I'm gonna call 911, so stash whatever you got on you because this girl's life is more important than your high, you know what I mean? But no sooner had I touched this guy, no sooner had I laid a finger on him, he grabs my wrist. The speed on this guy, heroin's supposed to make you slow or whatever, but that was nonsense. This guy's hit must have been working on him because he was like a freaking mousetrap. I touch him and whap. My fingers are wrapped around my wrist and he's turning in his seat to face me. Now I see him reaching into his pocket and my immediate reaction is to pull away because I think, Jesus, this guy's about to shank me. But he doesn't pull out a knife. He pulls out something else entirely. Still sharp, mind you, but what he did with it had me frozen to the spot. The theater is dark, right, but the movie screen is bright enough to light up like half of me and this guy, just enough so I can see what he's just put to my wrist. A syringe. He's not pricking me with it, he's just holding it there, and let me tell you, that was like a gun to my head. People reading this in 2019 might think that a needle is real bad, and obviously, yeah, it is. But this is 1982, all right? AIDS had literally just come out of nowhere. This country was scared. Not like COVID scared, buying all the toilet paper and stuff. People wouldn't use bathrooms after each other. Everyone's love life just disappeared overnight. This didn't go on forever, and people found out how to prevent the spread, but you didn't need no comorbidities for HIV to mess you up. And for a while, people just didn't know how it spread or with who. These days, they got all kinds of drugs that can manage HIV and AIDS or whatever. Magic Johnson is still going strong. I'd never have bet money on that back in the day, let me tell you. But back then, AIDS was like a death sentence, man. And not only did that guy threaten to poke me with a needle, what he said had me just about wetting my pants. Listen to me, he says. I got the bug. She got the bug too. Unless you want the bug as well, I get away from us, right now. I didn't say a word as he let go of me. I just turned around and walked out of the theater. Yeah, I called 911 like right away, cops and EMTs. All the while, I locked myself in the ticket booth and told my coworkers to stay clear of the cops when they arrived. The cops turned up with rubber gloves on, like surgical gloves, and just walked the guy out of the movie theater at gunpoint. I don't think they even touched the guy until he was at the car and they put the cuffs on him. That was a scary time to be alive, man, let me tell you. And that was a scary time for me too, obviously. But the people I feel really sorry for are the people who have to live with that godforsaken disease before science worked out how to fight it or whatever. That ain't no way to live, and it sure does make me feel lucky that I have my health. Back when I was a student, I worked in this tiny cinema in London's Soho district. There used to be loads of little picture houses that showed raunchy films back in the day, and I'd rather die than end up working in one of those. But back around 1990, some well-to-do musician type bought up one of the little cinemas and converted it into like a cult film cinema. I'd show all kinds of weird foreign films and documentaries, video nasty horror films from the previous decade, and it'd even host secret showings of banned films like that Italian Cannibal Holocaust film. But one of the things the little cinema was most famous for was showing these hardcore, ultra-violent Japanese anime films. These were a huge hit with locals and students alike, and some of the weeknight showings of things like Violence Jack or Angel Cop used to fill out more than the weekend showings of more mainstream films. These are kind of like the OVAs, that's manga jargon for original video animation, that have been straight up banned in certain countries because of how violent and obscene they were. Well, for their time anyway. The point is, they weren't easy to get their hands on, especially with English dubbing or English subtitles. So when we announced the showing of something particularly gruesome, you could bet we'd get bums on seats for weeks on end. It tended to be a lot of the same people coming each week too. Regular little cliques of anime addicts or gore hounds who shrieked and whooped whenever there was a particularly nasty kill. Most of them looked the part too. Leather trench coats, tattoos, lots of heavy metal band t-shirts. But then, one or two didn't look like the kind of people to be watching cult Japanese animation whatsoever. I suppose you can't always judge a book by its cover, But one particular guy looked so out of place that it was downright creepy. Me and the other guy who used to work the afternoon shifts used to just call him the Man in the Hat, because as well as being immaculately dressed in this navy blue suit and tie, he wore this old-fashioned wide-brimmed hat, the kind you'd see back in the 40s or 50s. First time he walked up to the booth before a showing and said, "One please," in his posh accent. I was sure he was lost. I actually asked him like, "One for Mad Bull 34? And he just nods. So, not being one to deny the bloke a new experience, I took his money, gave him a ticket, and unlocked the little turnstile for him to push his way through. Then, while everyone else is basically turning the place into a madhouse, showering each other in lager and cackling whenever anything gory happened, the Man in the Hat would just sit there, silently and happily watching the film. He didn't seem like a wrongin', just a bit weird is all. But then something happened during a showing of one particularly violent film that seemed to, well, push him over the edge, shall we say. So there's a part in this one film where these two fellas are having a scrap and one suddenly gets the upper hand and he rips his opponent's heart right out of his chest. Admittedly, it makes for some bloody amazing viewing, as it's not like a hi-ya, one and done thing. No. The bloke like hulks out, makes a kind of karate chop hand and then plunges it into his opponent's chest. Then, while he's actually got his hand wrapped around the enemy guy's heart, he starts giving him this big speech about how he never stood a chance, how he's got his very life force in his grip. Then, with literal showers of blood occurring, the guy crushed his opponent's heart, rips it out of his chest, and what follows is like a lawn sprinkler of blood just going absolutely everywhere. Not the kind of thing you'd watch with your granny on a Sunday afternoon, but it definitely made the time pass quicker at work when you're sitting in the projection booth like, what in God's name have I even watching? This is insane. While smoking a little bit of a J. Anyway, like I said, big long speech by the fella before he crushes the guy's heart, etc. The Man in the Hat had seen this particular film before. In fact, he was getting a reputation for showing up every time we showed it, without fail, and we were all about to find out why. Right before the guy's heart gets ripped out, someone a few seats down from the Man in the Hat jumps out of their seat and starts shouting something at him. Bearing in mind the actual theater wasn't very big at all, maybe only holding about 40 or 50 people at the time. So from up in the projection booth, I can kind of see what's going on with my bird's eye view. Someone is really objecting to something that the Man in the Hat is doing, so much so that they're jumping up out of their seat, pointing, shouting, then kind of shooing him out of the row. Someone else seems to notice, and at one point, I think this person is going to actually attack the Man in the Hat, who had to rush out of the theater to avoid the increasingly angry crowd. I find this whole thing a bit distressing, as he'd always been alright with me, but I didn't know what he'd actually been up to until the end of the showing. On their way out, I asked one of the customers what the Man in the Hat had been doing. "Disgusting," they were all saying. "Bloody nonce was sitting there wanking, wasn't he?" "Don't worry, mate. We've dealt with him for you," another said. "But don't let that beast back in, yeah? He was looking on blurting all over your lovely red carpets. Disgusting." You know what? As horrible as it was, I was gutted. I mean, I had seen him moving a bit funny at times during the showings, but I didn't think he was touching himself or anything. God forbid, well-dressed gent like that. And thinking he was getting off on all the violence, too. Like maybe he used to pop down to Soho to visit a peep show or two and he found himself something else to get off on. Something much, much darker. Anyways, years later I'm in a pub over in the West End, seeing an old mate of mine who used to work the cinema too. I'm not working at the cinema anymore. I have an actual grown-up job chasing down benefit fraudsters for the DWP, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the cinema a fair bit. Anyway, we're doing a spot of reminiscing, and all of a sudden, he near slams his pint down and says, "Did you hear about the prosy who was murdered by the old gore mine?" What we used to call the cinema, with it being in a basement unit. I tell him no, and he reminds me of the Man in the Hat. It had literally been years since I thought about him, and I gave a quick grimace as I did, but what did that have to do with some poor woman of the night being murdered? "Mate, someone picked her up, then dumped her on the street behind the old cinema, right?" my old colleague said. "And get this, they only went on to cut her heart out, didn't they?" Grim, but I still didn't quite see the significance. "Remember, what was the man in the hat beating his meat to when he got thrown out? What exact scene?" "The bloke ripping the heart out." My jaw's dropping as I'm saying this, and I started suddenly seeing the connection too. "You don't think..." "That's exactly what I think." Full disclosure, yeah. I reckon my old mate is as mad as a box of frogs. Always has been, always will. But he wasn't wrong about the man in the hat. And unless someone else in Soho has a fancy for the old Aztec heart-ectomy, it had to be our man. It was a bit surreal, honestly. I went from calling him a plant pot to seriously contemplating it. And then within about 45 minutes or so, we were walking down to Savile Row police station to file a report. The copper made it clear that we smelled like a brewery, and if we made any false statements, he'd personally make sure we were in charge for it. We told him, right hand to God, this is the God-honest truth. And then we told him all about the man in the hat, and that particular scene in Violence Jack or whatever it was. He soon changed his tune. About an hour after, we were soon talking to two blokes from the CID who wanted to know every little detail about the man in the hat. That's how we knew we were onto something. If there were no callbacks, no return interest from the coppers, then yeah, red herring. But the fact it got passed up the chain and then these two suited, booted types jump up on the case, something's going on there, don't you think? Far as I know, he was never nicked for it, and the murder actually went unsolved. Bit scary that, isn't it? Thinking he might still be out there or what have you. So when you're next in the pictures, and you see some fella wearing an old-style hat, sit a couple of rows back from him, will you? 'Cause it's likely that's not popcorn butter that's spilling on you, if you know what I mean. During my early 20s, I used to be heavily involved in the LA goth scene in the late 80s. I met some of the most amazing people ever, and I've stayed friends with some of them right up until today. But I think they'd be the first to agree with me that the goth scene back then was a bunch of kids trying to be something they weren't, and in our case, that thing was vampires. We were into the whole vamp thing heavy. Like we heard about the faux vampire enclaves in New York that were involved in bloodletting and blood drinking and all this other hardcore stuff, and I guess we just wanted to emulate that. The darker our meets and parties got, the weirder the people we attracted. And although I call BS on one of our number claiming that Richard Ramirez, that's the Night Stalker serial killer, approached them about attending one of our parties, we still got some pretty sketchy people hanging around. Sure, we talked a good game about bloodlust and death and slaughtering the cattle, as we phrased it, but we were just bored, slightly depressed kids. There wasn't any malice in what we were doing, and no one ever got cut or drank from unless they 100% consented. That being said, there were definitely one or two people that passed through our little social circle that most definitely didn't have the best intentions. And being the dumb, attention-craving teenager I was, I ended up pretty much falling into bed with one of them. There was only like one other gay guy who used to hang out with us, but I really wasn't into him at all. So when Zeno showed up, I just about lost my mind. Zeno was from Hungary, and I guess he got sick of trying to teach Americans how to pronounce his actual birth name, Joat, that he just went by his teenage nickname of Zeno. I was already swooning when he showed up. 6-foot-tall goth guy from Europe with jet black hair and dark eyes. But then when I found out that he was bi, oh my god, I just about did a somersault. So yeah, I get talking to him one night, offering up my wrist for him to do a little bloodletting, and we hit it off. Super cringy thinking about it now, but what else is youth for other than to get all your dumb mistakes out? Anyway, we basically start dating, and I'm just on top of the world telling all my gay friends about this bi guy from Hungary. It was just the best. He's just so moody and dark, constantly wearing black even though the Cali heat must have been killing him. He once told a friend of mine, "My blood is cold," in his sexy accent. Again, super cringe, but screw it. I was hopelessly in love. Only one of my friends, just one, seemed to have the presence of mind to warn me about him, saying something like, "Yeah, I've been getting really bad vibes off of Zeno like all night. I think this guy's bad news." That's exactly what I liked about him, though. He was bad. But I thought he was just at the upper echelon of the same way we were. But to my horror, Zeno turned out to be an actual psycho who I never should have dated in the first place. Again, uber cringe alert, so I'll keep it brief. Zeno was super dom, and I was super subby, if you know, you know. And a big part of his power trips was to ask me would you do anything for me? How far would you go? What are you willing to give me? And every time I'd be like, yes, anything, as much as you need. This idea just snowballed and snowballed until one night he asked me out on what he called a very special kind of date. I pressed him on what he meant by that, but all he'd given me was, "This is LA after all. Why don't we go to the movies?" I knew he wasn't about to just take me to see Terminator 2 or whatever. I knew there had to be some kind of twist in there, and that there was a lot more to this little date idea of his than just catching a flick. So I bit my tongue and just waited for the Friday night in question to see what he had in store for me. The time comes. He comes to pick me up in his hearse. Yes, you read that right. Guy bought an old funeral car for his ride, and we head downtown. Again, I ask him where we were headed, but he just smiles and tells me, "You'll see." After about 10 minutes or so, we pull up outside an old adult movie theater, so naturally I'm getting excited, but when I ask him if we're having a little adult entertainment date, he shakes his head and gives me this wry smile. So by this point, my curiosity is piqued. I have no idea how weird this date is about to get, but I sure was about to find out. I get out of the car and realize that the place looked closed. Like normally you'd have a marquee, flashing lights, at least something advertising what movies were being shown. But this place had nothing, not even any lights on, and like I said, it looked like it hadn't been open for years. There wasn't even anyone manning the ticket booth. We had to bang on the front doors until someone showed up to let us in. At the time, I just guessed that Zeno had prepaid or something because he and whoever was playing it being the steward seemed to know each other and no money exchanged hands. He just leads us into one of the theater rooms that was almost pitch black, with only a handful of other people sat around waiting for whatever movie was about to be shown. I'm practically vibrating with excitement by the time it comes for us to take our seats, and as we do, he leans over to me, takes my hand in his, and says "You get scared. Squeeze my hand. It's okay if you get scared, but we stay, not leaving, okay?" Now, he was dark, but had a heart of gold. He could show me his sensitive side from time to time, and good Lord, now that he'd shown me that, I was never leaving his side. Or so I thought. Because I figured we'd just gone to see some messed up Eurotrash horror film that had been banned in the US or whatever. Something gross but harmless where I'd end up cuddled up next to him, scared but not too scared, if that makes any sense. What little light there was in the theater dimmed and the screen came to life. But instead of having a title sequence or anything like that, a man in a black mask walked in front, lit up by the projector, and began to speak. I can't remember exactly what the guy said. It was 30 years ago now. And what I saw next kind of overshadows everything that came prior. But he basically said something like this in some overly dramatic mid-Atlantic accent. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to witness is no mere fiction, and is not for the faint of heart. This is true cinema verite, the naked truth of our lives laid bare, and to view it is almost as sacred as an act as to partake in its creation. So, without further ado, allow me to present L'amour d'Eve." Now please don't hold me to the film's title. That's literally just what it sounded like to me with my 2 years of high school French. Moments later, the guy stepped away from the screen and the movie began. Again, there were no title sequences, the movie just started. And I know this is dumb, but I thought the big guy's speech at the start was supposed to be like, build up hype or whatever. I didn't think he was serious. So when a picture comes on the screen of a semi-naked girl tied to a metal surgical table, I immediately start thinking, oh no, oh please no, this can't be what I think it is. The girl doesn't seem to be struggling or anything. She's just lying there all limp in front of some boxes with that crazy Russian-style writing on them. I knew something bad was about to happen, but whether or not it was all just an elaborate facade, it was just too soon to say. I know I should have just gotten up and left right then. But well, the things we do for love, huh? I give Zeno's hand a squeeze and a man comes into view. At least, I'm 99% sure it was a guy, because they were all covered up in those loose-fitting surgical scrubs. He walked into frame with what looked like 2 electrodes, placed them on the girl's chest, then nods to someone out of frame. The girl's body spasms all of a sudden, then she starts freaking out and struggling, where she's clearly been shocked into consciousness, only to be confused and terrified by her surroundings. That's when the man in the surgical mask begins to speak, and although I honestly couldn't tell if it was actual Russian or not, as I know a bunch of different countries use that kind of writing, he definitely sounded like he was in Eastern Europe somewhere. And as much as I obviously didn't know what he was saying, it definitely sounded like he was taunting or berating the girl who was tied to the table. The guy in the surgical mask then makes a show of tightening the restraints, with one kind of pulling her hips down so she couldn't move. I'm thinking, they have to give her anesthetic, right? If this is some kind of horrid surgical footage, they're sure to knock her out before they cut her open, right? Wrong. I was squeezing Zeno's hand as hard as I could as the guy on screen picked up a scalpel and began to cut into the girl's stomach. I tried my best to watch, I actually did. But as soon as I began to see all kinds of shimmering organ meat underneath the surface, I found myself forced to turn away. I thought Zeno would understand. I obviously just wasn't on his level when it came to actual gore. Cutting was one thing, but seeing that girl's guts on display made me want to puke. I thought he might see that he tried to push me too far, too soon, but he didn't. I felt him push me away and softly growl something like, "Keep watching, don't look away." I tried to keep as quiet as I could and not make a scene, but I begged him, telling him it was too much for me. He then told me that if I didn't watch, if I didn't at least try, he'd leave me here and never, ever call me again. This went on for a few minutes, and while my eyes are glued shut, things are still occurring on screen, only I can't see them obviously. Zeno's little ultimatum hurt, but I couldn't just let him go like that. He was like my dream guy, and I swear I'd have done anything for him. Turns out, though, there was a line and he'd crossed it. But still, I tried. Yet when I opened my eyes, it was so much worse than it had been before. The girl was such a mess that I actually gasped when I saw, and how a person can still be alive, writhing around and groaning when most of their intestines have been unraveled on their stomach. Jesus Christ, that image still sticks with me even 30 years later. I just couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't even believe I was doing it at the time, but I shoved his hand away from me, got up out of my seat, and just walked out of the theater. When I got back to my apartment finally, I cried for like half an hour straight, just ugly sobbing before I got it together enough to call one of my friends and tell them what happened. We didn't go to the cops or anything. I mean, maybe we should have, but I just prioritized on getting Zeno out of my life as fast as possible. I slowed down on the whole vamp thing after that. Zeno continually hung around that circle, so I just couldn't drag myself to meets and stuff. Seeing him flirting with girls or whatever just really tore me up inside. I'm kind of non-confrontational too, so maybe these days people would have singled him out as toxic or whatever, but back then, trying to speak out against the coolest guy anyone knew just seemed kind of pointless. I think the moral here is to have more respect for yourself than I did. Dom-sub dynamics are fun, sure, but I let that mentality get me into a situation that honestly could have turned out way worse. If you ask me, someone that's into snuff, that's into like watching people die. That's got to be only a few steps away from actually committing violence themselves, right? So who knows? Maybe if I'd met Zeno further down the spiral, I might not even be here to tell you this story. Because I made a real mistake getting stuck on that guy. And I literally have the scars to prove it. The scariest thing that ever happened to me was when I went to the movies with my boyfriend years ago. He's my ex now, but you get the idea if I just call him my boyfriend for the sake of the story. So we go see the Hateful Eight movie, the Tarantino cowboy one that's not Django. Right as the film starts, I need to take a whiz, so I run to the toilet, run back, and sit back down next to him. My eyes are like glued to the screen because I've already missed the first minute or so when I feel my boyfriend's arm come around the seat, I just snuggle into it and keep watching. A few minutes go by and I lean my head on his shoulder. He gives the top of it a little kiss and we carry on watching. Another few minutes go by and a guy 2 rows in front starts acting all weird like he's looking for someone. He's looking left, looking right, and then he turns around to look behind him. And it's my boyfriend. I instantly recoil from whoever I was cuddling with, and it's just some guy who had a similar hairstyle and beard, a totally different guy. My gut reaction is to be like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, I thought you were my boyfriend. But at the same time, this voice in my head is saying, oh my god, that perv had his arm around you and he knew you weren't his girlfriend. So I'm being polite and stuff, but at the same time, I'm beyond annoyed. The guy just started smiling and saying, sit back down and all this, and by that point, I'm struggling not to call him a creep and just slap him one, but I'm gonna go sit back with my boyfriend and tell him what happened. At first, he's just laughing like it's the funniest thing ever, and people in the theater are just looking over, telling us to shush and all that, even though we're trying to be dead quiet. But when I whisper in his ear what the guy had done, my ex was fuming. And what makes it worse is that the other guy was there with his friends and started carrying on with his, oh, come back here, love. Come have a little cuddle and all this. My ex tells him to shut it. Someone else threatens to tell the manager and have us thrown out. So everyone goes quiet for a bit. In the end, we thought it was just best to leave before they could try and start a fight with us at the end or whatever. So, before the film ended, we got up and walked out, just glad to avoid any conflict, really. My boyfriend was raging, but I knew that it just wasn't worth our time. But then as we're in the parking lot of the movie theaters, I turn around, and as I'm getting in the car, guess who's walking across the parking lot towards us? Same 3 guys that I sat next to by accident, and they're headed straight for us. My ex wanted to scrap with them at first, but I told him they'll probably end up just kicking both our heads in, and then they'll just smash the car up. So, get in the car, and let's just leave. We did exactly that, and thank God my ex saw sense in that moment, but even as we drove out of the parking lot, they started actually following us. And the way it was set up was that we had to come back on ourselves to get out, so we basically had to drive right past them to leave. I swear my ex went around one turn doing 45 just to put some distance between us, and they'd have definitely probably knocked a window out or something if they caught up with us. I gotta admit, it was incredibly scary towards the end, and I really have to admit that I did think that they were going to do us some damage, perhaps even just to the car. But honestly, it never ceases to amaze me how scummy some guys can be and just think they can get away with it. So it was only about a week after that Joker movie came out that I got a chance to see it. I'd been a huge fan of the Nolan Batman series. I loved how dark they made it. So the idea of having a dedicated Joker movie where everyone was saying how controversial it was, I was so psyched to see it. I can't find anyone to come see it with me, but I didn't care. I just rocked up to an afternoon showing on my lonesome, just tunnel vision Joker movie, gotta see it. I got popcorn, a soda, hot dog, the works. Just like when I used to go see movies with my dad when I was a kid. Then as I'm sat there in the dark, I start thinking to myself, you know, I always thought someone might pull some psycho nonsense at one of these showings. But it's weird because I hadn't heard anything about psychos in clown makeup shooting up any theaters. That's cool, I guess, but it would really suck if I just so happened to have picked the one showing of Joker that ends up getting shot up by some neckbeard incel, I thought to myself. But as I'm thinking this, the movie starts. Latecomers file into the theater. Everything is chill and not a single person I can see is cosplaying or looks like they're about to erupt into violence. So, cool. I just carry on watching the movie. Then, like 20 minutes in, there's only like 10 or 20 other people in the theater, and I hear someone laughing from the back of it. It's just kind of a subdued giggle at first, like the person's trying to contain themselves. But then it gets louder and louder, and it's obvious this person's just trying to get a rise out of everyone on purpose. People start turning around to see some absolute douche nugget dressed head to toe in Joker-style colorful pants and jacket. He's obviously walked into the theater in the last minute or so, because he definitely wasn't there at the start. And as he's doing this terrible impression of Arthur Fleck and doing a little dance, people start telling him to shut up, me included. Right then, the guy pulls out a freaking revolver from the back of his pants, and people literally start screaming and getting down on the ground, again, me included. I'm crouched down, making a move for the end of the aisle closest to the emergency exit. Don't get me wrong, I'm scared out of my wits, but at the same time I'm thinking, I knew it. Of all the times, dude, of all the times, it had to happen to me. I can still hear the guy laughing. I can still hear people begging him not to shoot as I sprint towards the emergency exit. Then, just as I'm about to open up, I look back to see the guy aim the gun at this terrified couple and pull the trigger. But instead of a flash, a bang, and one of the couple dropping to the ground, this absolute monster literally had one of those stupid toy guns that shoots out a little flag that says bang on it. It was made of plastic, but in the low light of the movie theater, and with all the terror that the Aurora Dark Knight thing caused, people were so ready to believe that it was real. When everyone realized what had happened, the guy burst out laughing again. Only this sounded like actual laughter, not the stupid Joker impression. Then just about everyone in the theater chased the guy out into the parking lot and into a waiting car. I swear to God, they were about ready to lynch this guy. I mean, I was ready to kick his head in too, but I swear the couple he pretended to shoot were just about ready to murder him right there in the parking lot. So not only did this piece of human garbage think it was funny to mimic the mass shooting, he also ruined my first time seeing Joker. So if anyone had a right to murder him, I think it should have been me. Also, I ended up checking social media and whatnot the next day just in case the guy was trying to make some viral prank video or whatever, but there was nothing. Nothing even in the news about it, which is messed up because he thinks CNN wouldn't pass up the chance to report on some incel violence or whatever. Definitely the scariest thing to ever happen to me, let alone in an actual movie theater. On the afternoon of Monday, January 13th, 2014, 43-year-old Chad Olson walked into a Tampa Bay area movie theater with his wife, Nicole. The couple had decided to spend a little quality time together, leaving their 3-year-old daughter, Lexi, in the safe hands of a trusted babysitter while they went to see the 2013 war movie, Lone Survivor. Those who've experienced being a young parent will tell you that private moments like the one they hope to share are far and few between, and we can only imagine how much they've been looking forward to it. However, as the Olsons nestled into their seats and the lights began to dim, another couple walked into the movie theater, that of 71-year-old retired police captain Curtis Reeves and his wife, Vivian. Their police officer son, Matt, had actually read Marcus Luttrell's account of surviving swarms of Taliban in the hills of eastern Afghanistan. So, when the movie of the same name came out, he naturally recommended that they go see it. But what neither couple knew is that a relaxed afternoon movie visit was about to turn into a living nightmare, and that shows how an everyday disagreement has the capacity to turn deadly. As Curtis and his wife took a seat in the row just behind the Olsons, he began to hear a rather irritating clicking sound. In the silence of darkness of the movie theater, it didn't take him long to figure out that the sound was coming from in front of him. As he peered over the seats in front, there was Chad Olson, illuminated by his own cell phone screen, hammering away at the keys to his phone without having bothered to put it on silent. Curtis was irritated, but even the previews had yet to commence, so he held his tongue. It was only when the movie theater's screen came on and a message about switching off cell phones was played that Curtis actually tapped Chad on the shoulder and asked him to stop texting. According to court documents, Chad replied that he was just texting his 3-year-old daughter and that he'd be done in a few seconds. But this wasn't good enough for Curtis, who then added something about how Chad should think of other people. According to Vivian Reeves, Chad then turned and spoke very aggressively towards her husband, insisting that he'd continue to text his daughter until he was finished. "It scared me," she said later in court. "I was horrified that somebody would act like that, especially in a movie theater." By that point, Curtis was done trying to reason with the increasingly belligerent Chad. He turned to Vivian, whispered, "I'm going to get a manager," then rose from his seat and left the theater, true to his word. When he returned, she handed him the popcorn and he sat down. According to witnesses, it's unclear who reignited the conflict upon Curtis's return, but what is clear is that Curtis informed Chad that he'd informed the theater's manager of his rude behavior and that he was due to be thrown out at any moment. "You told on me?" Chad reportedly barked. "Who do you think you are?" It's then that witnesses say that Chad reached with his tub of popcorn, aggressively emptying it all over Curtis's head. "It happened very quickly," Vivian Reeves later said. "His whole upper body just came forward and I thought he was coming over to attack us. But in reality, although the move was an aggressive one, Chad had no intention of actually harming the older couple. He simply wanted to humiliate them." Regardless of intention, seconds after the popcorn went flying, the movie theater was lit up by a single bright flash. Curtis Reeves had pulled a .38 revolver from his hip and sent a bullet ripping through Chad's torso. Chad's wife had actually gotten a look at Curtis producing the handgun, and in a moment of pure horrified instinct, she lunged forward and tried to put her palm over the barrel of Curtis's weapon. She didn't move fast enough, and the bullet tore through her hand, shattering bone and shredding muscle, before plunging into her unsuspecting husband. The formerly silent theater was now filled with the screams of those trying desperately to escape, mistaking the situation for one of a far larger scope and scale. Realizing what he had done, Curtis sat back down in the seat, put his hands on his head, and tried to comprehend just how much one foolish act would change the lives of everyone in that theater. An off-duty police officer who just so happened to be present at the time as the shooting slowly approached Curtis, took the firearm out of his lap and rendered it safe. The same officer later testified that Vivian turned to her husband and said, "What did you just do? You can't shoot into a theater full of people." Curtis simply cradled his head in his hands in a state of near catatonia, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. The terror was only compounded for responding police officers and emergency medical technicians. They knew very little of what had occurred at the scene, other than there had been a shooting in a movie theater. For some of them, this was highly reminiscent of the mass shooting committed by James Holmes in July of 2012, in which a heavily armed man let off tear gas in a Colorado movie theater before slaughtering the terrified moviegoers. Some people thought it was some kind of viral stunt, the purpose of which was to promote the movie. They sat smiling until Holmes opened fire, and it was only when they saw the dead that they realized what was happening. "We had no idea what we were headed into," said one officer following Reeves' arrest. "We didn't know how many victims, how many shooters, what they were armed with. I was scared that it might be another Aurora, but thank God no one else was hurt." It's true that Chad Olson was the only casualty of what could have been a much more violent event, but even so, the one death shattered a young family, and all who knew Chad were horrified and heartbroken that such a senseless death could even occur. "It's just going to be a huge hole in everyone's lives for him and his family," a friend of Chad's named Joe Trapani is reported to have said. "He'd give you the shirt off his back if he needed to. He was just an all-around great guy." It was a couple of words, no threats, no harm, no nothing, Nicole Olson later testified in court. In the blink of an eye, 30 seconds, it just shattered my world. Curtis Reeves' trial is set to begin this year, having been long delayed by the COVID-19 crisis, and although he already entered a plea of not guilty, it seems highly unlikely that any jury in the land will find his actions to be anything other than abhorrently violent and thoughtless. Reeves tried to invoke Florida's notorious Stand Your Ground laws back in his initial hearing in 2014, and although a man should indeed have the right to defend himself from legitimate threats, what threat did a bag of popcorn really pose? The terrifying thing about this particular murder isn't so much the violent outcome, it's how an everyday disagreement could somehow snowball into an actual murder. Not only that, but by all accounts, Curtis was an upstanding member of society, having never once committed any kind of crime prior to that day. In addition to his impeccable service in the U.S. Navy, Curtis has 9 letters of appreciation and an excellent duty award in his Tampa PD file. He was also a member of the local Crime Stopper Board, a civilian crime prevention network based in his Hernando County home. Even a neighbor of his, Bill Costas, spoke kindly of him when contacted by the media in the aftermath of the shooting. He was just a really nice guy, Bill says. Always smiling, and I've never seen him angry. A friendly type of guy, you know. If I ever needed help with anything, he was always willing to lend a hand. What people are saying about him, it just sounds like a totally different person. It just doesn't make sense to me, not from what I know of him. Curtis was certainly not a loose cannon, so why just snap all of a sudden? What makes a man like that suddenly lose all rationality and react to mild belligerence with a deadly response? We can try to rationalize such a violent event, explain it away using natural or supernatural means, but the truth is, you never really know who's out there, who you're going to bump into or rub up the wrong way. Some people won't be so forgiving over seemingly minor offenses, and just the slightest pushback could give them all the reason they need to widow your spouses or orphan your children. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links down in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.